Hi, welcome to Lecture 3, and this is going to be about the principle of cooperation, as you can see. And so we're going to jump right into it and say, it's a common observation that when people speak, when people communicate, there's what they say, and then there is things that are left unsaid that you haven't quite said, but that still are there, okay? And, people have used different terminology to refer to this. They've spoken of figurative meaning or indirect meaning. Why figurative? Well, because in many ways, metaphors and poetry is seen to be acting that way, but it doesn't have to be that at all. So indirect meaning is a better term here. But basically the point that we're getting at is that you can mean things indirectly that can be radically different from what you are saying directly. Okay? So the literal meaning and the implied meaning may be radically different. Okay? So let's take the example of the sentence, "I'll take the kids and leave you alone." Right? So if I ask you, what is the literal meaning of "I'll take the kids and leave you alone"? Well, we can look at it from the point of view of propositional semantics, truth value semantics, and say, I'll take the kids as a certain meaning, which is taking the kids, and then there is a second proposition, leave you alone, which is also meaning is leave somebody alone, right? So this is true if I will A, take the kids, and B, leave the person that's listening alone, right? And I and you are deictics that say the speaker will take the kids and leave the hearer alone. What are these kids? Well, here it's getting a little bit more complicated, but basically it's assumed that we know who the kids that we're referring to are, because we say the kids and not random kids, right? So I'll take the kids presumably means the kids that we know about, so probably our kids, all right? Now, I ask you then to imagine a context, and this would be a husband comes home. It's a traditional family. A husband comes home after a day of work, finds his wife, who's been home with the kids all day, and he's predictably tired and ready for some rest, and he says, "Honey, I'll take the kids and leave you alone." And this is a promise, right? I mean, this is a good husband who is understanding and says, "You've had a long, hard day dealing with my genetic material, and you deserve a little bit of alone time. You can take a bath, I don't know, have a cup of coffee, whatever." Now, imagine a different context. Husband and wife are having a bitter divorce battle, and the husband says, "I'll take the kids and leave you alone." Okay? Now, it's no longer a loving husband who is caring about his wife. It's a cruel and mean, vindictive husband who says, "I'm going to make you miserable. I'll take the kids and leave you all alone, and you won't see your kids," and whatever, right? Okay, we don't need to think about this, but the point is, in one case it's a promise, I'm doing a good thing, I'm doing you a favor, and in the other one it's a threat, I'm doing a bad thing, I am threatening to do something that you don't like. But the words and the said is exactly the same. The sentence is in both cases, "I'll take the kids and leave you alone," right? So what's the difference? Well, the difference is the context. Remember from the lecture on semantics, we said context is super important, okay? Well, this is exactly it. That is, the context is pushing one interpretation to the other, okay? One interpretation over the other, right? So then the question becomes, well, how do we know which interpretation of the sentence we should take? And there is an infinity of other interpretations. Okay, I mean, a different context would push different interpretations. So how do we go from what the sentence says to what the sentence is implying? Okay, and here we need to distinguish between two levels: the sentence and the utterance. Now, a sentence is a sentence in abstract, and at the level of long or competence, and an utterance is at the level of parole or performance. Okay, so to be schematic here, competence and performance. Okay, so the distinction here is a sentence is competence, which I misspelled, but that's okay, competence, and an utterance is a performance thing, okay? Which means that an utterance is a sentence in context, okay? So it's a specific, it takes place in a specific context, okay? And what that means is a specific speaker to a given hearer in a situation, etc., etc., okay? But the context is not enough, because, again, in any context there can be many interpretations. So then there's something else that guides the interpretation of the implied meaning, the indirect meaning. And that something is the cooperative principle that was proposed by Paul Grice. So Paul Grice is a philosopher, and interestingly enough, this idea of the cooperative principle has become super popular. There are literally thousands of articles and books about it. And I've read most of them. But the point here is it's become a super popular concept because it explains a lot. Okay? And so what does the cooperative principle say? Well, here's literally what Grice says. Make your conversational contribution as is required at the stage in which it occurs for the purpose of direction of the exchange in which you're engaged. Okay, that seems a little opaque. Okay, you probably don't have a very clear understanding of what it means. And we're going to work our way through it. But the point that I want you to notice here is as it requires at the stage in which it occurs for the purpose of the talk. Okay, and this applies to written language as well. Okay, so that's just not relevant that he's saying talk. It could be written as well. Now, people have made a lot of the fact that Grice says required. Okay, and so they've said, oh well, the principle of cooperation is prescriptive. Okay, in other words, it tells you what to do, but in fact that's not true. And it's just the word choice that Grice used that makes it appear prescriptive. But in fact, it's not. In order to highlight this, I reworded the principle of cooperation. Underneath is a non-prescriptive version of the principle of cooperation. Okay? So in other words, if Grice had been clearer about what he was saying, this is what he would have said. Which is basically, in order to achieve your goals for which you are engaging in conversation, okay, then the best way to proceed, the most appropriate way to proceed, is to contribute to the conversation as other people expect. Okay, and that's the basic idea. Okay, and as you can see, the prescriptive aspect of it goes away. Okay. So that's the first point. Now, the second point is, what is the purpose or the stage, of a conversation, right? What does that mean? All right. So in order to understand that, we need to go a little bit deeper. And Grice says there are a number of ways that we define the purpose of a conversation, right? And so he presents these as maxims. And again, this, on the one hand, it's one of the reasons why this has been so popular, because they're simple, they're straightforward, people like them because they're easy to understand. But why did he word them as maxims? Did he have to? No, he didn't. Grice liked to make sort of inner jokes, inside jokes, and that's a reference to Kant, of all things. He was a philosopher. Probably Grice thought it was hilarious. The problem is that then it's made this very confusing for people. So don't put any significance in the fact that they appear as imperatives. That's just because Kant called them the imperatives. You can word these not as commands as well. All right? So let's look at that. Well, the first one is, speak to the point, which he calls relevance. And the best way to see what is meant by this is to see what happens when we don't follow it. Okay? So here's an example. If somebody says, how old are you? And you answer, I like ice cream. Right? You haven't answered the question. The answer to the question is, well, I'm 55. Right? I like ice cream has got nothing to do with my age. In fact, I can, probably by saying I like ice cream, you may think I'm 5 or 10, right? Because children like ice cream. But I like ice cream. Okay? So it's completely irrelevant to my age. Yeah? So the problem there is that I'm not speaking to the point. If somebody asks you your age, you're supposed to talk about your age, right? Then the purpose of the conversation, if I ask, how old are you? The purpose of the conversation is to determine how old you are. So in order to speak to the point of the conversation, you have to answer about your age. You can't talk about ice cream or, golfing or the weather or, whatever. Okay? So that's what Grice meant when he said required at the stage at which it occurs. If there is a question, that's the stage, you have to have an answer to the question, and it has to be about what the question is. Okay? Okay, the second one, again, seems obvious, but it's not quite that obvious. So, tell the truth. And he calls this the maximum of quality. And of course, this looks like, don't lie, right? It sounds very, very prescriptive. But in fact, that's not it at all. Because what Grice means, and he explains this in the article, is there's two sides to telling the truth. One, say that for which you have evidence. Okay? So if I ask you, where is John? And you happen to have seen John in his office, you say, John's in his office. Okay? But if you haven't seen John, then you can't say John's in his office because you haven't seen him. So you don't know, you don't have evidence for the fact that John is in his office. Okay? Now, so that's one aspect that says, say that for which you have enough evidence. And the second aspect of the maximum of quality is obviously don't say something that is false. If you know that it's not the case, again, let's say that you saw John in his office, and you say, well, John is not in his office. Okay? That's clearly false, and you shouldn't do that. Okay? So two aspects to the maximum of quality. Don't say something that's obviously not true because you know that it's not true, and don't say something for which you don't have appropriate evidence. You have to have appropriate evidence for what you say. Now, the next one is the maximum of quantity. And this one too has two aspects to it, is don't say too little and don't say too much. Okay? Now, the don't say too little is fairly obvious. The example that I always use is, let's say that I say, students, I invite everybody to dinner at my house on Saturday. We'll have, steak and baked potato and all of that. I live near Lone Oak. and you're already in the car trying to put my address in the GPS. I said, well, near Lone Oak is not enough information, right? So you get back out of the car, you say, damn it, we don't get the steak and the baked potato, right? Because you didn't have enough information, okay? Now, so that's fairly obvious. Not providing enough information, you don't get what you want if you don't provide enough information. If you say, bring me the book, and you're in the library, say, well, which one, right? It's not enough information. You need to be more specific so that the person can bring you the book that you actually want, okay? Now, what about too much information? Well, that's a little bit subtler, but it's also important. And the best example that I can give you is if you've ever been in a car and you ask for directions from somebody, and they start telling you all sorts of information. It's like, you see that red house over there where, old Johnson used to live, and, and then he died, and, they sold the house, and now there's a really nice couple that lives there. Yeah, that's got nothing to do with that. So after a while, too much information becomes confusing, okay? And that's why you shouldn't say too much. And this has a very interesting, this is a little parenthesis, has a very interesting pedagogical implication, which I often like to state to annoy my colleagues in the College of Education, which is good teaching consists of hiding information from your students. Okay? Right now, there are thousands of things that I could be telling you about the principle of cooperation, which I choose not to tell you, because if I told it all, you would be incredibly confusing. Instead, I'm giving you the absolute minimum that allows you to understand the concept, and then if you want more information, you go look for it on your own. Okay? So, end of the little parenthesis. So quantity, don't say too much, don't say too little. And finally, maximum manner is a bit of a catch-all maxim, but basically the most important thing is be clear, okay? If people can't understand what you're saying because of ambiguity, because of obscurity in your wording, because you use words that they don't know, or syntactic construction that's too complicated, you're going to confuse your audience. And if your audience is confused, they don't know what you want or what you're trying to say, and hence you're sabotaging your communication, okay? Be orderly, same thing. If I say, open the book, go to chapter 2, and read the first paragraph, that's fairly straightforward, right? There is an order there. If I say, go to chapter 2, read the paragraph, open the book, you're like, what is he talking about? Right? Because I was not orderly. I didn't follow the steps. If you've ever cooked with a recipe and they say things like, take the chicken that you have previously blanched, and you're like, holy crap, I didn't know I was supposed to blanch the chicken before I put it in the pot. So now you have to stop everything, go blanch your chicken. Okay. So that's bad organization. The information is not presented in an orderly manner. And the idiomaticity thing is, if there is a received way of stating something, then people expect you to use that idiom. And if you use something else that's not the idiom, again, you're going to confuse people because they expect you to follow the accepted convention of language. Okay? So if you say pepper and salt, you're going to confuse people because the accepted idiom is salt and pepper. Okay? Okay. So then these are the maxims that basically make up the principle of cooperation. Remember, Grice said, make your contribution as required. Well, what tells you how it's required? The maxims, right? So then this created a confusion because people got really confused about what is the status of the maxims in relation to the principle of cooperation. And particularly, the problem was, can you violate a maxim while following the principle of cooperation, right? Now, Grice himself, actually for a change, is relatively clear. He says the maxims are more specific, And then I've given there a list of people, scholars in the field that explain, the point that I'm making, that is that the maxims are subcases, are instances of the principle of cooperation. Okay? So why does it matter? Well, as I said, you cannot at the same time be violating a maxim and following the principle of cooperation. And this is fairly straightforward. Think of a completely different example, just so that we're clear. Let's say that I have a rule that says, don't commit a crime. Right? That's a fairly straightforward rule. And then I say, okay, first of all, don't steal, don't kill people, don't rape people, don't embezzle money, etc. Right? So you cannot say, well, I embezzled money, but I was still following the principle, don't commit a crime, because embezzling money is a crime. You say, well, but I didn't kill anyone. Yeah, still, you embezzled money, right? So you still violated the principle of don't commit crime. Okay? So the fact that you're respecting some maxim while violating another one doesn't mean that you're not violating the principle of cooperation. Okay? Now, again, why is that important? Well, let me tell you. Because it turns out that if you don't follow the principle of cooperation, all sorts of things happen. Okay? And so much so that Grice himself and then a number of scholars have made a list of what happens when the principle of cooperation cannot be followed exactly, or you choose not to follow. Okay? So the most obvious one is when you just decide not to follow it. You're saying, I don't want to be cooperative. I just want to mess with people. So I'm just going to violate the principle of cooperation, period. Why? Because I can. Okay? You're not being cooperative. You're saying, I don't care. Right? So that's violating. Then there is opting out. And basically that's when you say, let's say that you're a politician that's accused of doing something, and the press is hounding you with questions, you say, no comment. Okay? Or, in a courtroom, the judge says, did you do this, Mr. Attardo? I said, oh, I'll take the fifth. Okay? Those are opting out, where you say, I'm just not going to say anything for whatever reason. Okay? Because it would incriminate me, because my lawyer tells me not to discuss it with the press, etc. Then so what you do is you opt out of the conversation for fear of having to violate the maxims. Okay? When you have a clash, it could be that you have conflicting demands among the maxims, right? So somebody says, hey, I'm looking for John. Do you know where he is? Now, you saw him walk in the building, but that's all you know. But that's not enough for the person to find John. So on the one hand, you're guessing that he's probably in his office, but you don't know for sure, right? So here there is a clash between the maximal quantity that says give as much information as needed to find John, and the maximum of quality that says only give the information that you have evidence for, but you don't know exactly where John is, right? So there is a clash between the two maxims, and you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. And then there is flouting, which is the most interesting of the cases. And that is defined, and here we're going to stress this, as blatantly failing to fulfill a maxim. Okay? And then Grice says, while observing the overall CP, and that's why people got confused. Okay? Because Grice didn't really mean this. Okay? What he meant is you're still violating the principle of cooperation, but you're not withdrawing completely from the conversation, as you would do if you were opting out instead. Okay? So what does blatantly fail to fulfill? We'll see this in a second. So, and again, failing to fulfill is violating. Okay, let's be clear about that. Okay, failing to fulfill is violating a maxim. Okay, whether you do it deliberately or not is a different story. So, again, violation is deliberate. If not, it's a mistake. Okay, and so there would be no intentionality, and there is no redeeming, and we'll see about this in a second. And there is no clash. Okay, it is like you just do it because you want to do it. Now, flouting is you don't follow, but you openly, blatantly, again, do so, and you redeem the violation with an implication. What does that mean? Well, if you make the assumption that the speaker is violating the principle of cooperation, but is doing so openly, then obviously they're not trying to deceive you, right? So if you ask me, did you steal the money? And I say, no, I didn't, right? Whereas in fact I did steal the money, right? But, you know, I mean, I'm in court and the judge is interrogating, the lawyer is interrogating me, the prosecutor is interrogating me, and says, did you steal the money? And I say, no, I didn't, right? I'm violating the principle of cooperation because in fact I did take the money, right? You know, so my intention is to deceive you, okay? But if I say, no, I didn't, and I'm waving a bunch of cash, then you say, well, what's the money that you're holding in your hand? I was like, oh, oops, right? So that would be a really, really dumb criminal, right? So if you are openly violating, then you're not trying to deceive, right? Because in order to deceive, you have to be hush-hush about it, right? I mean, if there's a video of me taking the money, then what deception is it for me to say, no, I'm not taking the money, right? It makes no sense, right? So then the idea is, well, if you are openly violating the principle of cooperation, why are you doing that, right? So consider this example. I'm in my office and the phone rings, and my secretary says, oh, sorry, and before my secretary picks up the phone, I say, I'm not here. Okay? Now, my secretary would say, well, sure you are. You're talking to me. What kind of an idiot are you? Right? You're talking to me. Sure, you're here. Right? But of course she doesn't. Right? Because she reasons, well, clearly he's blatantly violating the principle of cooperation by saying he's not here where in fact he's here. So what could he possibly mean by doing this? Well, assume that he's flouting the principle of cooperation, and the phone is ringing, so we both know that that's happening. So therefore, I'm going to come to the conclusion that he wants me to say that he's not here because he doesn't want to talk to anyone on the phone. Okay? So that's the line of reasoning that you would follow, right? So let's look at this other example. Let's say that I say to you, Mary and John were in the library and they were not reading books. Okay? Now, what do you understand from this? Okay? Well, do you think that they were making pasta? Or learning skydiving? Or sculpting a marble statue? No. Right? And yet, all three of these activities that I just described are not reading books. Right? So why is it that you didn't think of that, but you thought that probably they were making out? That's probably what you thought. Right? So that's because, well, we have frames and we have encyclopedic knowledge about libraries and what you do in a library, what you can do in the library. Now, notice that if I say they were not reading books, I am clearly, openly, blatantly violating the principle of cooperation because I'm not providing you enough information. Okay? If I had said, I saw Mary and John in the library and they were making out, okay? That's following the principle of cooperation. I'm being clear, to the point, straightforward, providing you enough information. If I say, well, they weren't reading books, I'm not providing you with enough information. I'm having you do the work of figuring out what's going on, right? So it's a blatant violation, and then you can redeem it, you can recuperate by saying, oh, I assume he's trying to tell me something else, and that something else might be that they were making out. Okay? Now, so we just saw how to get an implicature by flouting, but it's also possible to generate implicatures without flouting, just by following the principle of cooperation. Okay, and again, this confuses people often. So you have two ways of generating implicatures. One is by following, and the other one is by flouting. Okay, so let's say that somebody asks, "Where's the closest?" Somebody in a car asks, "Where's the closest gas station?" And the answer is, just around the corner. Okay, so the assumption here is that the gas station is open, and therefore the speaker is cooperating, and if you turn around the corner, there will be a gas station, right? Now, notice that if the gas station were closed and the speaker who answers knew that, they wouldn't be cooperative, okay? That is, they would not be cooperating with the speaker, they would be, in fact, misleading the speaker. Why? Because the speaker presumably wants to fill up their gas tank. That's why they're asking about the gas station, right? So this is called, in the terminology that I introduced, there's other terms, perlocutionary cooperation. It is cooperating for the ultimate goal of the speaker. Then the locutionary goals are the goals that the speaker has as part of the conversation. So getting understood, that kind of thing. Okay. So here we can see the distinction between the two. Locutionary cooperation, cooperate to the success of the exchange, and perlocution cooperation, the success of the goals of the agent that go beyond language. So as another example, when does the train for Glasgow leave? 10:30. Well, the train is not running today because there is a strike. Okay? So if you know that the train is not running, there's no point in telling the speaker when the train is leaving, because the train isn't leaving, right? So if you assume that they want to know because they want to catch the train to go to Glasgow, then obviously it's not cooperative to say 10:30 if you know that the train isn't running, right? So in this chart, there's other terminology that other people have used to describe this. Okay, so so again, to recap, you can get an implicature through flouting, blatantly violating the principle of cooperation, and then redeeming with an implicature the violation, or by following the principle of cooperation, and then the assumption is, for example, that if that the train, when does the train for Glasgow leave? At 10:30. The assumption is that the train is running, and that you will be able to get on it and get to Glasgow. So in other words, that I'm helping you achieve your goal of going to Glasgow, right? So that is an implicature that follows from assuming that the speaker is being cooperative. Okay? Now, as we said, there is this distinction between linguistic cooperation and extra-linguistic cooperation. So here I gave a description of what the extra-linguistic cooperation principle would look like. You don't need to remember this. It's just there for entertainment value. However, this one is really important. You need to remember that the principle of cooperation is based on this idea of rationality. Okay, that is, the idea is that Grice is presupposing that the speakers act in their own self-interest. Okay, that's what rationality basically means. is that you're a reasonable person that does things for themselves reasonably. Now, that doesn't mean that you're, just like an egoist that doesn't like to share, etc. That's a completely different thing. Rational just means that you're employing the best means to an end. Okay, that's what a rational subject means. Now, the other aspect that's important is that you claim and receive responsibility for what you say. So if you say, we'll go, if you behave, we'll go to the zoo, that's a promise, right? So by saying that, you have committed yourself to going to the zoo if the person behaves a certain way. Okay, so that's a promise, that's a speech act. Okay, you will remember from the speech act lecture, that you assume a responsibility of your word. That is, you're gonna have to be true to your word. Okay, now, this is not a common view of Grice, but that's what he says. But again, it's a logical conclusion of what Grice is saying, is that you have to assume he presupposes that the speaker is rational. Now, he's not the only one that has said this. There is a list of people here. You don't need to remember all of these people. I just want you to understand that this is not my view. It's a common view. But here I have an interesting example that I want to go over. Why is that even interesting? Well, here's a good example. Some people, Sarangi and Slenbrook, for example, say, well, there's cases in which people just are not being cooperative. They don't do what the speakers want them to do. Okay? However, we can demonstrate that this is not necessary. Okay? And the example that they have is an actual event where a graduate student goes and tries to get a prescription from, there's a mistake here, this should be agency, from an agency of the British government, and is denied. Okay? So Sarangi and Slenbrook say, well, therefore speakers just are not, they're not being cooperative. Well, but that's not true, in the sense that there is a reason why the employee of the British government denies the prescription. Is that if he or she gave the graduate student the prescription that they're asking for, they would get in trouble, right? Because their supervisor would say, why did you give this person the medicine that they weren't entitled to, right? So then rationally, the civil servant in the example chooses not to cooperate because it would harm him or herself, right? So if you assume that people are rational, then apparent violations of cooperation disappear, because it's not that the speaker isn't being cooperative, it's that the speaker is being rational. That's an example of why rationality is important. Okay. Now, finally, I want to talk about two things. One is this idea of literal meaning, and I said, the idea of literal meaning is problematic. So the basic idea is that, and this is called compositional semantics, the basic idea is that the meaning of a sentence is the sum of the meaning of the morphemes and the syntax of the sentence. Okay? So that you put together the meaning of the word Mary and love and John, and the fact that it's Mary loves John and not John loves Mary, that gives you the meaning of the sentence Mary loves John. That's called the principle of compositionality. Okay? Now, however, people have shown that this is not true, in the sense that there is meaning that needs to be contributed by the pragmatics that enriches the literal meaning. Let's go back to the example that I used at the beginning of the lecture of I'll take the kids and leave you alone, right? Now, when I say I'll take the kids, and it's a husband speaking to his wife, we assume that those kids are the children that the husband and the wife have had together. In other words, they're their children. If the husband said, I'll take the kids, meaning the neighbor's kids, the wife would say, what the hell are you talking about? What are you doing? Why are you taking the children of the neighbor? The neighbor would probably call the police because they'd say, my children are being kidnapped, right? That is, but, you know, so the kids just means people, children that we have identified, that we know who we're talking about. But we enriched this sentence significantly by saying, these are the children that you and I have had together. Okay? Now, notice that, for example, if the wife had been running a daycare at home, the husband could say, the kids, and mean the children that you've been taking care of, I'm taking them back to their parents. Right? So, again, completely different meaning. But in order to know what children are we talking about our offspring? Are we talking about the clients of the daycare? Are we talking about the children of the neighbor? You need pragmatic information. You need knowledge about the context, right? And so the context enriches the meaning of the words, right? And so then literal meaning is not just the sum of the words and of the syntax. There's more to it, and this is this enrichment concept. The other thing is that some research in psycholinguistics has basically demonstrated that people don't necessarily start with the literal meaning and then draw an implicature. Now, and this is called direct access. The idea is that you directly go to the implied meaning without passing by the literal meaning. Well, here some scholars have said, well, of course you don't, because you don't necessarily go for the literal meaning first, you go for the most salient meaning first. And salient means the most active, the most frequent, right? So if I say cup, the meaning of cup as in cup of coffee is more salient than if I say, the trophy that you win if you win the World Cup, right? I mean, it's a cup, but it's a different kind of cup, right? So the meaning of cup as in cup of coffee is far more salient than the trophy, right? And then other meanings of cup that are there, right? So you go for the most salient first, and so if that happens to be the indirect meaning, then you will go for the indirect meaning first. And then a completely different thing, people are making predictions on what the sentence is going to be saying even before the sentence has started. Okay? If I ask you, how old are you, you expect that I'm going to tell you my age, right? And so you're making predictions as to what the words that are going to come out of my mouth are. And so that's going to affect the implied meaning as well. Now, on top of this, we need to remember that there is a point, is that Grice was not a psycholinguist, he was a philosopher. He wasn't interested in the way implicatures are actually processed, which is what psycholinguistics does, right? So it's kind of a straw man argument. It's not that the direct access view invalidates Grice. Grice's model says nothing about how people actually process it. It's a theoretical model, okay? And then finally, I want to talk about the boundary between pragmatics and semantics, which we kind of already brought up a little bit. And this is usually called an interface, right? Because you have semantics on one side, pragmatics on the other, and the boundary is the interface between the two. So there is, the original view was that you have the said, which is the literal meaning, and then the implied, which is the implicatures that you draw. Well, that's really been discarded. Now people have moved towards this idea that there is more to the literal meaning than just semantics. There are these things like enrichment, which we talked about, and explicatures, ad hoc concepts, affordances. You don't need to go into the details of any of this. My point is here that there is more to the literal meaning, which is semantics, and that some pragmatics has to be used in order to get at the meaning of the sentence. The propositional meaning of the sentence includes pragmatic information. Okay, that's all you need to remember. Now then, there is an alternative view that basically says, well, semantics and pragmatics, there really is no boundary. They're the same thing, and if you look at the frame semantics, they incorporate contextual information, encyclopedic information into semantics already, and therefore, they don't see a neat boundary between semantics and pragmatic. It's all meaning. Some of it is more contextually based and some of it less contextually based. Okay, but you will encounter this expression, the semantics pragmatics interface. So you need to know what we're talking about, and basically it's where does meaning end, semantics end, and pragmatics begin. The meaning that is quote unquote literal meaning and the implied meaning. Where does one end and the other one begin? The answer is it's a gray area. Okay? All right, so this concludes our lecture on the principle of cooperation.